So there's no way after that full psychedelic effect, there's no way that individual will think what he has taken is placebo. So what you do is you use what we call an active placebo.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 206th episode of this podcast, looking at anything and everything that we can do to help the better workings of your own brain, including on rare occasions drinking something which might best be described as a witch's brew. This might not be the best episode for all brains. We're definitely going to be talking about a controversial subject here, but one that's had a lot of requests is something that we cover. A traditional Brazilian brew known as Ayahuasca, considered by some to be a very, very strong medicine, and it's actually being tested out now by science to see what the medical efficacy of it might be for fighting conditions like depression and addiction. We're going to be speaking with a researcher who's done a lot of study into ayahuasca. His name is Dr. Draulio Araujo. If you hang around until the end of the episode as a little bit of a counterpoint to some of the talk we'll be doing about depression in the main interview, I'm going to tell you about how happiness can be a real heartbreaker, literally in this case. You'll have to wait for that in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick, but right now let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So it is an absolute standby in sports movies, and in fact in a lot of movies, when something dramatic or important happens to drop into slow-mo. But you can imagine, you know, your favorite sports movie, the baseball player's hands grip the baseball bat as he takes his little mini swing, or the basketball player doing a couple of super slow-mo dribbles before the big shot. And oftentimes people that study sports psychology really talk about the idea of athletes getting into a flow state and time slowing down, perceptually speaking, from the athlete's perspective. And there was a pretty interesting study put together to test exactly this idea that was recently published in Psychological Research. The researcher Carmelo Vicario and his colleagues recruited 20 female basketball players, all of whom were definite basketball experts. They'd been playing for an average of 12 years each. Then they also got 20 experienced volleyball players and 20 sports novices. So a total of 60 people, and then they compared their performance on several perceptual tasks watching basketball videos. So they had the participants watch short basketball videos that were just over 2 seconds in total duration. Each video was showing a female basketball player throwing a ball at a basket. Then about half a second after the video started, each video was blanked out for a short duration, and then it resumed the video with either a continuation of the same movement from the same woman, or it might have cut to a different shot by the same woman from the same angle. So you can imagine in this latter case, very similar, but maybe not quite right. And the task that the participants were given was to say yes or no. Was the second part of the video from the same actual basketball shot, or when they cut out and cut back in from the video, were they actually showing two basketball shots spliced together? And to make things just a little bit more complicated, some of the time when it was all the same basketball shot, the amount of time that the screen went dark was the exact same amount of time as was omitted from the video. So the screen might go dark for 1/10 of a second and they omit 1/10 of a second of the video clip. Other times there might not be a time lock there, so they might omit 1/10 of a second of video, but they actually jump 3/10 of a second ahead in the video when they come back in. Or the other way around. So you could have the exact same amount of time, you could have somewhat telescoped time, or you could have compressed time. Each of which you might imagine might make it a little bit more difficult for a person to accurately gauge, is this the same shot that you're seeing when the video comes back? So here's what gets interesting. The study participants who are expert basketball players did much better at answering the question yes or no, is this the same shot that you're seeing or not? They did better than the high-level volleyball players and better than the sports novices. Those other two groups did statistically indistinguishable. Basically, it didn't help you any with your basketball analysis to be a good volleyball player. But the basketball experts only did better in the instances where when the video cut back in, it was either correctly time synced, or if the amount of time that was blacked out in the video was longer than would have been necessary to cover the action that would have been missed from the video. In other words, if when the video cut back in, it cut in at a point that would have been further ahead in the action than the participant's mind's eye would have been able to keep up with the flow of the movement, if that was the case, then the basketball experts did no better than anybody else. However, if the video cut back in at a speed that would have been either normal speed or as if the video had been running in slow-mo, then the basketball players did markedly better. And in fact, they were actually more accurate if the imagined video had been running at a slow-mo speed than if there was just a real-time actual speed omission of the video. And the researchers took this to mean that this is at least consistent with the idea that basketball experts really are capable of envisioning what's going on in a basketball game in sort of a slow motion type analysis of the game. They want to try to replicate this study now in other sports and see if these findings hold. Personally, I'm not totally persuaded this is the correct interpretation of these findings, because it also seems like the basketball players are just more accurate in their yes or no call the closer that the moment of the video that comes back in is to the moment of the video that they exited on. That doesn't necessarily imply slow motion perception to me. It just might imply that the further out you have to forecast from the last actual piece of data you had, the less accurate you're going to get. But either way, a really interesting study design, and also worth mentioning, when they ran a variant of the experiment where when they cut back into the video, it was showing the ball already having left the basketball player's hands. It wasn't just showing a continuation of the shot. In that circumstance, the basketball players did no better than anybody else in giving the thumbs up, thumbs down as to whether it was the same shot. So the real expertise doesn't seem to extend to the geometry of the ball in flight, but really about the motion of the human athlete.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Om Yoga Diva from the USA says, "Just keeping company with you and your guests makes me smart. I am lucky I found you, and I love how you keep the topics fresh. I am grateful and delighted for each episode." And listener SBJ30 from Australia says, "This brilliant podcast delivers content that is so informative and interesting. We love you in Australia, and we would love some Smart Drug Smarts t-shirts, please." Well, thank you so much. A very big thank you for those very nice reviews. That goes for SBJ30, Om Yoga Diva, and anyone else out there who's helping to spread the word. Not sure about the t-shirts. We actually did get a couple of t-shirts done up years ago, but just for around the office, never actually mass-produced those. I'm not totally opposed to the idea, but it seems like perhaps a bit of a distraction. I'm happy to send the Smart Drug Smarts placard and logo and all that stuff to anybody that's curious. So if you want to get your own Smart Drug Smarts t-shirt or coffee mug or whatever else made up, I am more than happy to support you in those endeavors. We really probably should take a page from Apple's playbook and start including little Smart Drug Smart stickers on everything that we mail. If you're wondering just what it is a digital enterprise like a podcast mails, it's a good question. The answer is not a whole lot, but that's not true of the couple of sponsors that we have, Vitamonk and Axon Labs, each of which mailing things around is pretty much their thing, and I bet if we ask nicely, we could get them to slide in some Smart Drug Smart stickers. A big congratulations to the first and second place winners of Vitamonk's October Surprise Contest last month. That was Jorge from Seattle and Tom from Denver, who got year-long and 6-month-long subscriptions, respectively, to whatever it is that they wanted from the Vitamonk.com site. Jorge went with the NutriRes Advanced Resveratrol Complex supplement, and Tom went with Adaptotrax, which has a combination of different adaptogens, rhodiola rosea, ashwagandha, cordyceps mushrooms, among others. But though that contest is over, the commerce rolls on. Vitamonk still has their launch list, which is a great way of finding out about new products as they get released. smartdrugsmarts.com/launch to find out more about that. And over at Axon Labs, I know they've been getting a lot of questions about international shipping. The general answer is in almost all cases, yes. That's not a blanket yes. There are a few holes in the map of the world that they can't ship to, but just a few asterisks on the overall yes. We can send off both Nexus and Mitogen. And if you want to check out either of those stacks, you can do so at axonlabs.io. Couple of interesting things coming up on the near horizon in the Smart Drug Smarts newsletter, The Brain Breakfast. Going to be talking about the power of sunlight, some little-known facts about pirates, and even an anecdote from my most recent trip to the Department of Motor Vehicles. If you are not signed up for The Brain Breakfast yet, you can do so at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. A big interview coming up today, so let's jump ahead.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So among the many things that most people had never heard of before the internet, and might not have made it out of a very small, limited regional scope and subculture, is a drink that's been getting a lot of attention in recent years called ayahuasca. This is a ceremonial, highly psychedelic substance that's made from a couple of plants that grow in the Brazilian rainforest. It is only because of the slow spreading of the knowledge of ayahuasca in the churches for which it is a sacrament out into the wider population of Brazil and subsequently to parts of the rest of the world that most of us who have heard of this have come to have heard of it at all. I would guess that in the past 10 years, there's probably been at least a 10 times growth in the number of people who have heard of ayahuasca who have known what it is. No, I have not tried this myself. The number of safety warnings and do not try this at home, kids, and medical caveats is probably quite a long list. Although, as we'll hear, there are a lot of people who do this on a regular basis with not much in the way of medical complications. So despite some of the dangers, it certainly seems to be something that the human body can sustain and sustain for long term. But what's really interesting about this compound is not what it does to the body so much as what it does to the mind. In this interview, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Draulio Araujo, who is on sabbatical now in the U.S. He's up from Brazil, from his normal position in the Brain Institute of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte. And he has been studying ayahuasca and its effects in a medical context for many years now. If you go to Google and type in ayahuasca, you're going to find scads of anecdotal reports. I tried ayahuasca, this is what it did for me. Firsthand recountings and experiences and that kind of stuff. You know, in almost all cases, this is not a compound where you take it and nothing happens. Something's going to happen, and good, bad, or medium, it's going to be a story. But first-person stories aren't really something that you can take to the bank when you're talking about a medical study. And that's where Dr. Araujo is really getting his hands dirty, diving into the science here, looking specifically about the effects that ayahuasca may have on depression. And this is somewhat of a longer interview than normal. We really go into detail on the series of studies that he did, some of the difficulties in testing a substance where you really can't have an inert placebo, the physical and emotional pyrotechnics that come with using ayahuasca make an inert placebo isn't going to fool anybody. But it's really interesting hearing how his study was designed, the progress that he's made so far, and what he's learned. If you already know all the basics of what ayahuasca is and sort of the birds and the bees of how this mix is made, etc., you might want to skip ahead maybe 10 minutes into the interview. The first part is just kind of laying the groundwork of here's what ayahuasca is. If, on the other hand, ayahuasca is new to you or you're just looking for a refresher course, then start listening now. This is Dr. Draulio Araujo, and we're talking ayahuasca.
So in part, I think that what's happening with ayahuasca has to do also with the fact that what science has been showing or suggesting is that ayahuasca, it's not that harmful. It has its dangers, but it's not that dangerous, especially if that's taken in an appropriate setting. The second reason why ayahuasca is becoming more well-known in the last few years is that there are some religions in Brazil that use ayahuasca as their sacrament, and these religions are also doing this move of spreading to other places, from Brazil to United States, from Brazil to Europe. So here in the US, there are some churches that do use ayahuasca in their rituals. So some churches from Brazil that are setting down and having their temples here, setting up their temples here in the US, getting the rights to bring ayahuasca from Brazil or produce their own ayahuasca over here and conduct their religious ceremonies. So maybe these are the two main reasons why ayahuasca is spreading through different parts of the world. But that comes with a price as well, because if you look at the sustainability of using ayahuasca, ayahuasca comes from two plants, and the vine is something that takes a while to grow. So I know of some people that have been worried with the sustainability of using ayahuasca in the near future because there are so many new churches and rituals, and it's spreading so fast that people are struggling to have that balanced with the sustainability of growing the vine and having enough ayahuasca. This is maybe the price that people are paying.
Yeah, that's ironic. A victim of its own popularity. We think about things like, the black rhinoceros and people wanting elephant tusks, and a problem that we typically apply to animals when we think about it. But it could certainly be the case for a rare and non-cultivated plant like this, or a plant that has this very particular area that it lives that's not being grown on cornfields in Iowa.
Yeah. And the most typical formulation of ayahuasca is a combination of two plants, right? So you combine the leaves of one plant called Psychotria viridis with the bark of this other vine called Banisteriopsis caapi. You mix them with water, and then you cook this tea for many hours. The resulting liquid is this brown liquid with this very strong taste and smell. One of the plants contain a psychedelic component called dimethyltryptamine, or simply DMT. So if I make a tea using just the leaves, I'll be capable of extracting the DMT. But then when I drink that tea, that's not going to have a psychoactive effect because that molecule is going to get degraded by some monoamine oxidase that we have in our gut. But then when you mix these leaves with the vine has what we call monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So it allows DMT to enter our blood circulation system, and then we have a psychoactive effect.
Yeah, it's like there's a built-in safety mechanism on the DMT. And
yeah, well,
I guess safety is not really the right term, but if you're thinking of it like as a firearm where there's a switch that needs to be flipped before it can actually be activated.
Right. Yeah, correct. So somehow they managed to find that, and it works.
And this has been something that's been known about going way back into prehistory, time immemorial for people that live in this region of the Amazonian rainforest.
Well, yeah, but the real evidence of artifacts, people using ayahuasca, we do not have a lot of evidence. So the most striking evidence comes from northern Chile, from the desert in northern Chile, where they found in some artifacts, they found traces of harmine, which is one of the components of ayahuasca. And that dates back to, I think is the 11th century, but I'm not positive about it. But the thing is that make people think that there was this kind of a trade between the rainforest people, the rainforest Indians, with people that lived in the northern Chile, because in the northern Chile doesn't grow these plants that are needed to make ayahuasca. But Indians have been using that for a very long time until it spread to the urban centers in 1930.
And there are huge amounts of case reports and anecdotal stories about what happens to people on ayahuasca. But what do we know with scientific rigor as to what's going on when somebody drinks this?
So the scientific research with ayahuasca started, I'd say, maybe 20 years ago by this group in Spain. The guy who coordinates this group is a guy called Jordi Riba, and he's the one who's been doing most of the research with ayahuasca, and certainly he's the guy is the most prominent scientist with ayahuasca. And they have done a lot of the basic stuff that allowed us to try ayahuasca as an antidepressant. So, the fundamental rocks of science as far as testing for how people would react using a psychedelic substance in a lab, measuring the concentrations of DMT and the other substances in the blood, trying to trace what are the effects of ayahuasca in the short term. So what are the acute effects of ayahuasca? So they used a number of scales to try to translate both the safeness of using ayahuasca in the laboratory and also to trace the main effects of ayahuasca, so the main psychedelic effects of ayahuasca. They did conduct some very nice EEG studies, so electroencephalography studies, trying to understand what are the effects of ayahuasca in sleep patterns, for instance. So they really built these base blocks that we could kind of stand upon it and conduct our experiment with depression. And as far as science can tell so far, ayahuasca is a substance that leads you to a very specific altered state of consciousness that brings elements that are common to us, like elements that comes from dreaming. So when we are dreaming, we do have a lot of images. So dreaming is basically seeing very complex scenes with the eyes shut. And ayahuasca also tends to have effects that are very similar to a dreaming state, in which you would have access to the colorful kind of images that can go from very specific geometric patterns to very complex scenes, conversations with people that you don't know, and things like that. It also have a profound impact on your mood. A lot of times it comes with changes in your mood, both as a positive mood, and in the case of ayahuasca, it can also bring you this very weird kind of impatient kind of mood. And that is a very particular effect of ayahuasca that other psychedelics don't have, which is the somatic kind of effects that ayahuasca have. A lot of times and very often people do feel a lot of nausea. Some people have the tendency to vomit, and some people do have diarrhea related to the acute effects effects of ayahuasca. So alteration in the visions, alteration in the mood, alteration in the perception of the body. Ayahuasca also has this effect of increasing introspection. People under ayahuasca tend to be a lot more introspective. They tend to remain with their eyes closed for most of the time, having a very introspective experience. And by introspection, I'm calling introspection just the ability to be aware of your own thoughts and your own emotions. And the other property of ayahuasca, and that's very common to other psychedelics, is people tend to have mystical experiences when they are under the effect of ayahuasca, to the point that some people call these substances entheogens. So not psychedelics, they call it entheogens, to bring the idea that those substances are capable of giving rise to this entity that we could call God, or this superior entity that's within you. I think that these are the main things that the science of ayahuasca have brought today. So, dissecting the effects and trying to figure out how safety it is to use ayahuasca.
It's interesting that of the big psychedelic compounds that people have heard of, there are a lot of psychedelic compounds, but of the sort of the heavyweights, ayahuasca is the only one I can think of that has this physical purge of vomiting and nausea. I might be wrong about that, actually. Now that I think about it, mescaline might actually be doing something similar, but psilocybin, LSD, they don't have these effects. Is that something that you think should give people pause, that there is this overt rejection by the body?
Right. Although we call all these substances, LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, mescaline, psychedelics, they all have very specific nuances to their effects. And one nuance to the ayahuasca effect is, as you said, the body sensation. So I think that ayahuasca have something that's very particular as compared to other psychedelics, which is a very powerful mechanism of increasing introspection. So to me, it's very clear. One difference, for instance, between ayahuasca and LSD is the tendency that one have to move in with ayahuasca and somehow to get a little bit more distracted with the outside when with LSD. So it is as if you'd have a more internal experience with ayahuasca maybe, and part of it might be due to all the body sensations, the nausea and the vomiting, which is not a comfortable feeling, and that maybe make people to rely more on the present because they have to watch out for those symptoms.
So it's almost in that sense like a sort of escaping into your interior landscape because your physical body might not feel so hot.
Right. And again, I mean, that puts ayahuasca in a special place because to me, it feels very weird when someone reports on having used ayahuasca to go to a party.
Right.
So it doesn't really make sense, to me to use a substance that make you throw up, even though you still go to a party.
Yeah. Diarrhea and parties don't mix very well.
Right. So I think that that's a very important component of ayahuasca, the body feeling, to a point that part of the therapeutic effect of ayahuasca, at least from the reports that we have been getting and from the anecdotal reports that we have from the churches in Brazil, it feels that this plays an important role in the therapeutic effect. People in religion interpret the vomiting as a purging effect. And we do have examples in our lab, for instance, of people that purged very much. We had this one patient, she purged very much throughout the session. And at the end of the session, she asked me if I had seen that red ball of meat that she threw up. And I said that I didn't see it. And she told me that she was trying to point me out for the red ball of meat when she threw up. During the effect, she was like, I have to show this to him.
Oh, God.
And then
awful.
At the end, she said, but it was so relieving to throw up that ball of meat that was here in my chest for years. And that was a patient with depression.
Yeah.
So the interpretation maybe that a lot of people naturally give to these purging effects are really a purging of getting rid of things that you don't need, to a point that a lot of people interpret that as a very important aspect of the therapeutic effect of ayahuasca, even in the churches. In the church, they purge, and purging is bringing them a benefit out of the experience. They're getting rid of things that they don't need.
For the communities that have been using this for a long, long time traditionally, what is the tempo of use like? Is this something that your average person does once a month, once a year, only when they're sort of at a particularly psychologically heavy period in their life? Like, what is normal use of ayahuasca like?
Today, there are many different rituals or groups that use ayahuasca in Brazil, but there are two churches that are the biggest one. One is called the Santo Daime Church, and the other one is called the União do Vegetal, which is the Union of the Vegetal. So these two churches, they do gather every 2 weeks. So this is normally they do it every 2 weeks, unless there is a special occasion, like they celebrate the Day of the Death. They do celebrate that day with a special ceremony, so that there is an estimate in Brazil of around 20,000 people that are part of these churches. So the latest estimates think that 20,000 people drink ayahuasca every 2 weeks.
So really not that many in a country the size of, I'm not sure what the population of Brazil is, but it's got to be tens of millions.
Oh, yeah. It's a small sect. But on the other end, if you consider that 20,000 people are drinking that every 2 weeks, that tells something about how safe that substance is.
Right.
But it's a very small community.
So what got you interested in looking at ayahuasca's potential effects as an antidepressant therapeutic agent? Are there particularly low levels of depression in the community that uses ayahuasca traditionally, or what turned your interest this way?
The way we moved into this was from the first set of experiments that we did. So the first set of experiments we did was basically aiming at looking at the brain of individuals under the effect of ayahuasca, using techniques such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, or EEG. When we started programming this protocol, we thought that it would be a good idea to recruit experienced individuals from the churches that use ayahuasca regularly. So we went to one of these churches in Brazil called the Santo Daime churches, and that's where we recruited most of our volunteers for the first set of experiments that we conducted. So when we started recruiting these subjects, we had a lot of contact with the people in the church. And then it became apparent that ayahuasca had a therapeutic potential. And by then, that was 2006, we realized that there were two ways we could follow. One of them was depression, because a lot of people in the church would say that they got better from their depression after they started using ayahuasca. And the second group of people were the ones who reported getting better from their addictive behavior to different substances, mainly alcohol, tobacco, and some reports on crack and cocaine. So we discussed as a group, and we just decided that we should move to evaluate the antidepressant effects and not evaluate the effects of ayahuasca in drinking or smoking habits. Although there are some groups in Brazil that are starting to study this other path, we decided to understand the antidepressant effects of ayahuasca.
Were the people that were experiencing these changes, were they coming into the church from outside of this community and they hadn't been using ayahuasca previously because of that? Or were they already church community members, but they just weren't using ayahuasca?
Most of them, they are there because they heard of ayahuasca as something that could help them.
So sort of a self-selected group.
Right. And this is a main thing for science, because we know the power of religion and the therapeutic power of religion. So we do have, many religions in Brazil that claim to have this therapeutic effect on the same things that, people in the Santo Daime Church were reporting, like getting better from their addiction. So from the scientific perspective, our first idea was to test the effects of ayahuasca outside of a religious setting. So bringing the substance into a laboratory setting where religion itself itself would not play a major role. So when we started doing this, the first idea was to test for the safety of using ayahuasca with patients with depression. We know that psychedelics are substances that are very sensitive to set and setting. In other words, the effects that you're going to get when you have a psychedelic experience will depend a lot in the set, in other words, in how you are, and in the setting, in other words, where you are, with who you are, what are your intentions, and all that. And if you consider that into perspective, then you see that a person with depression have a very particular set.
Yeah.
So one first question we had was, how is it that these patients will react to an experience with ayahuasca? How safe will these people feel to drink ayahuasca in the hospital? And how is it that, they're going to feel their own experience? So this was the first aim of this first project. And the second aim of this first project was to use clinical scales for depression. So in other words, we have clinical scales from psychiatry that have been designed and validated to measure the severity of depression. So we used this scale with these patients, and we had these patients going through a single session with ayahuasca in a hospital. So they were all naive to ayahuasca. That was their first experience with ayahuasca. We recruited them and have them participating in this, what we call an open label trial. And this open label trial, basically what we did was to give ayahuasca to these patients. And these patients, they were all what we call treatment-resistant depression. So they were all patients that were not responding to the commercially available antidepressants. So we recruited them. They went through a single session with ayahuasca, and then we measured what were the symptoms, their depressive symptoms before the session with ayahuasca, and we followed these patients for 21 days. We applied these clinical scales that measure depressive symptoms one day before the ayahuasca session, and then one day after, 2 days after, 7 days after, 14 days, and 21 days. So with that design, we could follow the temporal evolution of the depressive symptoms after that single session with ayahuasca.
I should have asked you this earlier, but how long in terms of hours does a typical ayahuasca session last?
So it usually lasts for 4 hours. The acute effects, these changes of perception, these changes of a mystical type of experience, they usually last for, less than that, like 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, or 2 hours. So the peak effects last for about an hour and a half. And then the later effects are more dominated by a kind of a tranquility, or all the cognitive effects are reducing, and then it leaves the subjects with a feeling of tranquility, of being more calm.
And in this open label study, was there any sort of counseling during the experience that went on, or was it just a purely chemical intervention? People were sort of left on their own as far as what they were thinking about?
It was a purely chemical intervention, although the researchers stayed with the person in case we felt that they need some kind of help. Some people do go through a lot of suffering, for instance, and sometimes it's important to have someone right next to you just saying, I'm here, don't worry, that's going to go away. So it's important to have this kind of supportive environment, but we did not interfere with their own experience. So we did not try to guide them through the experience.
Right.
We were there, but not guiding them. But then there is a caveat, a very important caveat in open label studies, the placebo effect. And this becomes very important in depression, because the placebo effect in depression can get as high as 50 or 60%. So in clinical trials for depression, and by clinical trial, I mean a trial that's aimed to test a substance against a specific condition. Any trial for depression, the response for the placebo treatment reaches about 50%.
Wow. So yeah, you give somebody a stick of chewing gum and 50% of them are going to say that their depression feels better.
Right. So it means that when you do an open label study, particularly when you do an open label study for depression, the results that you're getting are very likely to be contaminated by the placebo effect. So it might be as well that what you're observing is just the placebo effect. And the placebo effect is something it's marvelous. I mean, it's something I've never had the chance to see the placebo effect before we conducted this randomized trial with ayahuasca. So that was our next step. Once we finished the open label study, then we started programming the randomized control trial. So in 2011, we started planning this randomized placebo control trial, which is a big challenge for a psychoactive substance, because how is it that I'm going to bring some confusion as to what the individual have taken if that individual feels the full psychedelic effect? So there's no way after that full psychedelic effect, there's no way that individual will think that what he has or she has taken is placebo.
Yeah.
Right? What I'm saying is that there is no way you can blind a subject from a psychedelic experience if they have taken the real psychedelic. So the only thing you can do is to modulate the group that goes through the placebo treatment. So what you do is you use what we call an active placebo. So you use a substance that have effects, but you do not expect to have an antidepressant effect.
Right, clever.
So what we did, we developed this substance. So before that, it's important to know that all of our patients, they were naive to ayahuasca again. And that made things better for the blindness because, people don't know what to expect. And especially with ayahuasca that has this very strong and very characteristic smell and taste. So what we did was we did produce this placebo that has this brown color, a very weird, bitter, and sour taste. And we added a little bit of zinc oxide inside the placebo. And zinc has this property of bringing some nausea and vomiting or diarrhea. So one subject threw up and one subject had diarrhea with the placebo. So this is one way that you can use in order to have a more robust randomized control trial, right?
Yeah. I imagine you're going to a chef and just saying, do your worst. We want something that'll taste terrible and make people vomit.
Right. So we started in 2011, this randomized control trial. So we started recruiting and having the project sent to ethics committee, run after money to run the project. In January 2014, we started data acquisition in this project. And basically, the idea was really similar to the project we had in open label study. So basically, we had these psychiatry scales, these clinical scales for depression. We had that at baseline. And then we had 1 day after the dosing session, 2 days, 7 days, and so on. But this time, half of the patients that we recruited went through an ayahuasca session, and half of the patients went through a session with a placebo substance so that we could compare these two groups. All of these patients, they were free from any antidepressant medication. They were in what we call a washout period, which is a period that you're free of antidepressants when you're switching medications, antidepressant medications. So they went in this washout period for 2 weeks, and then half went through a placebo session, half went through an ayahuasca session. And the results we found, they were really interesting. First, because we had such a high placebo effect that was just amazing to observe. As a scientist, I felt at some point, that the placebo effect was even more interesting to study than the antidepressant effects of ayahuasca. It's just unbelievable that you have people with 25 years of depression, like some of the subjects we had, that tested 9-10 different commercially available antidepressants, that did electroconvulsive therapy. We had one subject that went through 25 different electroconvulsive therapy sessions, and that after a session with placebo, they just get rid of their depression.
Yeah, you don't know whether to say that's amazing or how incredibly frustrating in a sense.
It was really, Jesse. It was unbelievable. I looked at it and I was like, no, that's not possible. Like we had one patient. This was one that's someone that I'm never gonna forget. He had depression for 25 years. His body was stiff as a wood. He would not look at anyone in the eye. He would just look down. He would not speak much. Mm-hmm. And then after a session with a placebo, one day after the session, he didn't have any symptom of depression. 2 days after the session, he looks at me and he says, "Doctor, these medicine from the Indians," and then he would put his hand on his forehead and wave like he was an Indian, like there was like a feather. And he would say, "This medicine from the Indians is just like a miracle." And he had these beautiful dreams. I mean, beautiful. He would describe the dream for like 40 minutes. And he was like, "You know what I'm going to do today? I'm going to ride my bike. That's at home. I don't even know where it is, but I want to ride my bike at the beach." And when I was listening to the whole thing, I'm like, man, he went through a placebo. Because I knew it.
So you've got a good poker face, because this was a blinded but not a double-blinded placebo control study, because you knew.
Yeah, right. That's another very interesting point. We tried to do it as double-blind as possible, but at some point we realized that for us, that we're following the individual. So what we did basically was we sent all the samples we had to the pharmacy department at our university. And every week we would send them an email saying we need 50 ml of substance A, or we need 60 ml of substance B. And they were the only ones who knew what substances A and B were. We didn't know it.
Yeah.
But then, after 5 seconds, I already knew what A and B was.
Because of the distinctive smell.
Because of that, and we decided to do something different, which was we would not have someone evaluating the patient. In other words, the psychiatrist who applies the clinical scales to the patients, they will not follow the patients in the experimental session.
And this is just because the smell itself was such a giveaway for you?
Right. Well, the smell and the effects. If I had substance AB 3 times and B was ayahuasca, well, 3 times I would know already. Almost 100% of our individuals had a full psychedelic effect or a very profound psychedelic experience. So just by talking to them, I know what we had. So we had this group meeting, and what we decided to do was we had a team of 5 psychiatrists running the clinical evaluation. In other words, running the clinical scales. And these guys, they never followed a single individual throughout the session. So they were there, right next room, in case something, in case we needed. But most of the time, what happened was that we had one psychiatrist who would apply the scales for the baseline, and for the follow-up measurements in 1 day, 2 days, 7 days later, it would be another psychiatrist.
Did you ever, in the course of the experiment, run into somebody having a real episode where you thought somebody might have a psychotic break or anything like that? Were there any kind of trouble spots?
No, never. We did see people that did suffer very much. But one thing that was very intriguing, not only for this experiment, but to me is very intriguing for ayahuasca as a whole, is that when you have an individual, when we had our subjects laid down in this recliner we had in our lab, it's kind of a bedroom, like a living room kind of place. So when we had our subjects in the recliner going through the experience, if they didn't say a word, we would not know if they were in ayahuasca or a placebo. Because they would just, close their eyes and most of the time don't say a word for 3 or 4 hours. And afterwards, when they would report their experience, then we would right away guess that they went through an ayahuasca experience. It was really hard to tell just by looking if the individual was in an ayahuasca or in a placebo. But we did not have any kind of psychotic outbreak. We did have some difficulties or some individuals that felt more anxious with the experience. So we did have some individuals that would look at me and say, please take me out of here. I just can't stand that anymore. And there's nothing we could do really. So basically we were there with them, touching them. So touching seems to be a very important thing, and calling them by their names and talk to them, as calm as we could, saying that's going to go away, but I can't do it right now. Just relax, pay attention to the music. So they were allowed to, they had a music playlist they could listen to. So we tried to maybe taught them through the experience so that it would make things easier. One thing that, to me is important to say is all of our subjects, even the ones that went through these more anxious states, all of them reported feeling safe.
That's good. That's interesting.
And this is one thing I find interesting. At first I thought, well, giving ayahuasca to people in a hospital, will that work? Considering that there is all this very sophisticated ceremony around it, independent on, who's conducting the ceremony, a church or an Indian, or there is this very complex and well-structured kind of ceremony. And we did not have a real ceremony, right? We only had like a hospital. But at the end, a hospital seems to be a place that people feel safe.
So where did things go next after this active placebo study? Where are things now?
So the first thing, after we finished up collecting data, we had 35 patients that went through this experiment and 50 individuals, healthy controls. So we had 85 people that went through this experiment. Out of the 35 patients, we only considered for analysis 29 because 6, there were some issues, like they were, like I told you, they were in this washout period of 2 weeks. And some of them got better and a lot better from their depression in the washout period. So that can give you two conclusions. One is that the side effect of their current antidepressant was doing a lot of harm. In other words, you could have side effects like you don't sleep well. What happened in some of our patients was that they got better in this washout period. And as they got better, there was no point of treating them.
Yeah. Why mess with a good thing?
Right. Well, actually, what we did, if they were better, we just didn't want to also have them going through these, I got excluded from the trial. Why is it that I got excluded? That kind of emotion, we didn't want to have them going through that. So basically what we did was we had them going through the experience, but we did not use that data in the trial. So we kind of fulfilled their expectations. We thought we would be respectful for their expectancies and all that. And we knew that that was not going to do any big harm from what we had seen before. There was no one who got worse. So we decided to go on and have the sessions, but not use the data. And the first finding we had was a very significant and robust decrease in the depressive symptoms in both groups 1 day after dosing. In other words, we had about 50% of our patients responding either to the placebo or to the ayahuasca 1 day after the dosing. 2 days after dosing, that persisted. 7 days after dosing, then the placebo group got worse, and the ayahuasca group kept their improvement that they from day 1 and day 2. So the results we have basically is that ayahuasca had a significant antidepressant effect that is higher than the placebo effect, particularly 7 days after dosing. This is our result. We are working to have it published. We are having, I'd say, a hard time to have it published. We have it at this preprint repository. It's called bioRxiv. And then in parallel, we have been submitting it to different journals, mainly psychiatry journals. Unfortunately, it's getting rejected without a lot of scientific explanation of why it's getting rejected. All the rejections we got so far, they were not based on a fair review process. They are based on editorial decisions.
What do you take to account for that?
Well, I think that first thing is it's a psychedelic substance. So there is a lot of taboo around it. It's ayahuasca that there is some additional taboos to it. It comes from the Indians. It involves religion and it involves a drug. So maybe the only taboo that's not included is sex.
Right.
And the other thing that I believe the reason is that unfortunately it's because it comes from a third world country.
Where the study was conducted.
In Brazil.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that is not the only reason, but I do think that plays a role. I think what we have, it's a very important result. It's a preliminary result because it comes from a very limited number of patients, but I'm confident that we did a very clean trial from the scientific perspective. To the point that, we never got a bad review that says there's a flaw here. We got reviewed. We got revised 3 times for 3 different journals, and the reviews are positive. So I think that these 3 factors are important as the reason why we have been having this hard time publishing it. But eventually it will be published because it's, like I said, I'm confident that the data we have it's clean, is robust. We did not make it. It's there.
And so where would you like to take this for next steps, things you'd like to look at in follow-on studies?
So I feel that we have 2 potentially interesting paths. One of them is to have a trial, and that's being programmed right now, to have a trial in which you give more than 1 dose to the patient. Because what we did was a single dose, right?
Yeah.
A single session. So it feels that it's time to propose something that's more like a treatment in which, you have the individuals going through, say, 3 different sessions, 5 different sessions every 2 weeks. So have a more robust kind of experiment with more patients. The other path is to understand where the effects come from. So if this is a real antidepressant effect, can we use just a very straightforward pharmacological explanation to the effect, saying that dimethyltryptamine is a substance that modulates our serotonergic system, which is the system that seems to be deeply implicated in the pathophysiological aspects of depression? That is a way of explaining it, right? So to use a very pharmacological explanation and straightforward. But the experience itself might play a role as well. So maybe we should also approach the benefit from a psychedelic experience using an analogy with psychotherapy.
Yeah, and it could be both. I mean, it could be a combination of both factors.
Could be a combination of both factors. So the substance could facilitate. So some people do believe that an interesting therapeutic window is to use these kind of substances during the therapeutic procedure so that these substances would provide some help in the therapeutic process with the help of a psychotherapist. So a lot of the groups have been working with this perspective. But, people get better from their depression just by doing psychotherapy. So it might as well that one part of the effects, the antidepressant effects of ayahuasca, comes from what they felt during the experience. And in fact, some of our patients, and I find that really interesting and intriguing, some of our patients said that they did not like the experience for the same reason they do not like psychotherapy.
Sort of a backhanded compliment.
Or that it felt like I've done 5 or 10 years of psychotherapy in the session, in these 4 hours. So I think that these are the 2 main goals of our group right now, is to, improve the study that we did and to understand where the effects come from.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a big thank you to Dr. Draulio Araujo for taking the time for that interview. That one definitely went some directions that I didn't expect. We spent a lot of time talking about placebo. It puts me back in mind of some of our earlier episodes on the topic of placebo as a topic unto itself, just how powerful those effects can be and how they can also actually layer on top of real effects. It's hard to even get the terminology right because placebo effects are real effects, but on top of medically, pharmacologically derived effects, placebo effects can be sort of a second layer. We also learned how to make the near-beer equivalent of ayahuasca, the ayahuasca version of O'Doul's. And interesting to hear that about the anti-publication bias in psychedelic studies even nowadays. That's a little bit contrary to what we've heard from some of the other researchers working currently in psychedelics. It seems like that stigma might be lifting, but on the other hand, that doesn't mean that there's not a stigma still there. Really interesting, although researchers will certainly have their work cut out for them trying to disentangle some of these ideas that we were talking about at the end, to what extent the psychological aspects of the intervention with psychedelic versus the purely pharmacological aspects, how those two interplay, if they're dissociable, what the mechanisms of action are for each, and obviously lots more research needed. We kept this episode pretty much on the medical and investigational aspects of ayahuasca, but for those of you who are clamoring for an ayahuasca episode, I'm wondering, is there still the appetite out there for more of a what's ayahuasca actually like from a perceptual standpoint? What's it like for the people who are having these experiences? It's certainly a deep topic that we could plumb further, so if you heard this episode, you liked it, but you want more, drop me an email. There's certainly more than one angle we could look at this from. But let's move on now, as promised, to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So if there's still anybody out there who doubts the definitive connection between the mind and the body, they really need look no further than something called the Takotsubo syndrome, often abbreviated as TTS and also known as broken heart syndrome, which is literally when strong emotional stress can lead to a specific kind of heart attack characterized by a sudden temporary weakening of the heart muscle, which causes the heart's left ventricle to balloon out from the bottom, while the neck of the ventricle remains narrow, which creates a shape somewhat like a Japanese octopus trap. If you don't know what one of those looks like, you're in good company. But it is from this octopus trap that the Takotsubo syndrome gets its name. Patients suffering from TTS feel chest pains and breathlessness. This often leads to heart attacks and sometimes to death. And in 2011, researchers established the first international Takotsubo registry at the University Hospital Zurich in Switzerland to gather information that could be statistically analyzed about the specific type of heart attack resulting from this syndrome. By 2016, they had the first 1,750 patients registered from 25 different collaborating centers in 9 different countries. And that was enough for them to start pulling data together. They actually found 485 patients for whom there was a definite emotional trigger for their TTS event. And interestingly, of these, 4%, so 20 of this group of 485, experienced an event that precipitated their heart condition that was actually an emotionally positive event. Literally a heart bursting with joy sort of moment that could have profoundly bad physical consequences. Examples include birthday parties, weddings, surprise farewell celebrations, or the birth of a grandchild. The vast majority, 96% of the emotionally inspired Takotsubo events came from events with a negative emotional valence, the kind of things you might expect, the death of a spouse or a child, the kind of story that if you'd heard it, you might hear somebody say, yeah, that person died of a broken heart. But the researchers really hadn't been expecting to see positive emotional events also being tied in reasonably large numbers to Takotsubo syndrome, said Dr. Elena Gadri. We've shown that the triggers for TTS can be more varied than previously thought. A TTS patient is no longer the classic broken-hearted patient. Clinicians should be aware of this and also consider that patients who arrive in the emergency department with signs of heart attacks, but after a happy event or emotion, might be suffering from TTS just as much as a similar patient presenting after a negative emotional event. Very statistically significant was the fact that 95% of the patients in both the broken hearts and the happy hearts groups were women. The average age of the patients was 65 among the broken-hearted group and 71 among the happy-hearted group. This confirmed what had been the previous anecdotal understanding that the majority of TTS cases occur in postmenopausal women. Dr. Christian Templin, the principal investigator on the study, said that further research will be needed to understand the exact mechanisms underlying both the broken and the happy-hearted variants of TTS. We believe that TTS is a classic example of an intertwined feedback mechanism involving the psychological and/or physical stimuli, the brain, and the cardiovascular system. Perhaps both happy and sad life events share final common pathways in the central nervous system output, which ultimately lead to TTS. The researchers are now using fMRI studies to look further at the relationship between the brain and the heart, particularly looking at areas of the brain known to be involved in processing emotions, reactions, behavior, and memory, such as the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast that thinks too smart for your own good is really just a figure of speech.
Okay, so that was it for episode number 206. Thank you for hanging around with us until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find the links to everything that we talked about here up at smartdrugsmarts.com/206. And last week, if you missed it, in episode number 205, I spoke with Dr. Nick Pomalaski about Ambien. Some really interesting serendipitous findings about things other than sleep that it might be able to do for the brains of people with certain neurological conditions. And next week, we're going to have a return appearance from Dr. Charles Nichols, looking even more deeply into his work with fruit flies, serotonin, and psychedelics. I will see you back here for that next Friday. Same time, same podcast, and with that same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.